Fulton Sheen, God and the Intelligence. Continuation of Chapter 6. The Complete Reaction Against Intellectualism. A real attack against scientism had to come from science itself in order to strike at the foundations. Its weapons must be the findings of science, and not dark, cavernous, subjective states, practical reasons, and traditions. The credit for making just such an attack must be given to the eminent French scientist Émile Boutroux, who, in his work La Contingence des lois de la nature, dealt the first real telling blow against the predecessors of the field of science. Scientific theories are in reality only conventions. They are expressions of habit of nature. Laws are only provisional because they are symbolic. They are only the expression of the functional relations. The aim of science, therefore, is no longer to find the natural laws that exist in the objective reality, for these laws are evolving as science evolves. The search for the external necessity in the world is not the ideal of the scientist. Rather, it is to manufacture the truth. Scientific hypotheses are merely devices of the mind used to explain the world in a simple fashion without recourse to experience, while hypotheses are pure conventions. M. Poincare does not admit that they are caprices, because they are useful. They have a quality which a whim does not always possess. From this brief expose of modern science, the following conclusions may be drawn. 1. A characteristic of modern science is the increasing stress on the importance of mathematics. Mathematics is the best expression of the functional relations of measures. It is what may be called a mixed science, a science formally mathematical to which the physical data furnishes the matter. Einstein, for example, took time out of the province of physics and placed it in the field of mathematics, and so much so that his theory is not wholly intelligible except in mathematical language. 2. A second characteristic of modern science is insistence upon intuition, the contribution of mind to matter. Science has passed from being merely a passive revelation of external reality to the interpretation. It now adds something over and above the phenomena, and something which the phenomena itself cannot give. There is an opposition between the brute fact and the scientific fact, as Poincare has put it, or between the brute fact and the theoretical interpretation of Duhem. Mind gives something which matter does not give. In other words, there is intuition in science. 3. Scientific theories are but mere instruments and tools without any permanent value. The formulae of sciences are not true, they are merely useful and convenient. They serve for a time, and sooner or later are supplanted by new and other formulae. They are relative, therefore, to the advance and convenience of science. Such is the attitude of the modern scientist toward his subject matter. It is far different from the old notion of science, particularly that of ancient physics. It is different because it is more limited. In a certain sense, it seems to be recognition of the contingency and the want of necessity that is in the pure empirical order. But what is the outlook of philosophy on this new scientific spirit? There are 3 possible points of view open to it. Philosophy must have ignored it altogether and gone on speculating about material things without ever looking in the direction of science, or it might have entered into a full consideration of the findings of science and rendered an appreciation of their conclusions in the light of the more universal principles of philosophy. Lastly, it might have taken up an attitude of subordination in which philosophy steps down from its high throne as the mistress of science, and instead of availing itself of the conclusions of science, becomes its servant. This latter attitude has been that of modern philosophy. Modern philosophy is a lyric poet of science. By the principle of lyricism is meant that immediately upon the discovery of an important theory in one science, modern philosophy applies it to its own field, whether it is applicable or not, instead of making scientific discoveries its master. It ministers unto them. Descartes' philosophy was born of an excessive devotion to the new physics and the astronomy of his time. When Newton discovered the laws of gravitation, Kant sought to give philosophy the same certainty that Newton gave physics, and thus escape the empiricism of Hume. Comte gave the world a new sociology, and philosophy began to turn itself into sociology. Darwin described the origin of species by evolution. Philosophy lyricized Darwin and evolutionized everything, even God. Nietzsche lyricized the principle of the conservation of energy and his eternal return. This process of lyricism is more rampant today than it ever was. We have just noted above the conclusions of modern science, conclusions which strictly and properly belong to the study of the empirical as empirical. But no sooner have these scientific notions been advanced than a group of philosophers march forward to lyricize them, to apply the methods and the conclusions of a science of one order to that of an entirely different order. In a general and broad way, the lyricism may be represented as follows. 1. Empirical science. Formulae are convenient. They are not true, but useful. Philosophical lyricism. A. Philosophical principles, God, eternal varieties, are useful. Their truth is to be determined by their usefulness. Pragmatism. B. Pure thought is philosophy, and pure formulae is science, are functions. Man is the measure of truth. Humanism. C. The value of the idea, as the value of the scientific hypothesis or formulae, is determined by its instrumental or functional efficacy. Instrumentalism. 2. Empirical science. Mathematics gives the best expression of the coordination of the physical laws which experience makes known to us. Thus, space and time in the Einstein theory are made intelligible through mathematics. Philosophical lyricism. A. Defection of space and time as ultimates, either in combination or singly. S. Alexander, Space-Time, and Deity, M. Bergerson. Elevation Créatrice, B. Croke, The Philosophy of the Spirit. B. Mathematical renderings of logic. Logic and mathematics are identical. The common ground of the two is either indefinable notions and 20 undemonstrable principles. 3. Empirical science. Laws add something to fact. Scientific hypothesis in nature interpreted by mind. The pure fact is quantity. The interpreted fact is quality. There is intuition in science. Philosophical lyricism. Philosophy is the science of the qualitative. Intuition gives the qualitative. Intelligence gives the practical, quantitative fact. Quantity is repetition. Quality is creation. Quantity is determination. Quality is liberty. Quantity is pervisible. Quality is novelty. 3 conclusions disengage themselves from this brief review of modern philosophy. First, modern anti-intellectualism is the great part of lyricism, of the scientific reaction to exaggerated scientific intellectualism of last century, and is not due to the recognized failure of the intelligence to serve speculative needs. Mechanism was made identical with the intellect, an equation which should never have been made, and in reacting against mechanism, the intellect fell into dispute. Secondly, the reaction against intellectualism is really not a criticism of faculty, but of a state of mind. An intelligence accidentally mutilated and blind by the positive and mechanistic schools have been confounded with the precious intelligence which God has given to man when he formed him in his image and likeness. Thirdly, the whole anti-intellectualist position is a confusion between reason and intellect. Scientism was a deification of reason, not of intellect. When this reason, which had exaggerated confidence in its own powers, had been proved unsound, the modern philosopher was satisfied that he had destroyed the intellect. The proposed substitutes for the beast intellect have therefore no right to exist. They are merely substitutes for distorted reason. The intellect, in its true nature, has never been considered throughout this whole wave of thought, which has so wrongly styled itself anti-intellectualist. It is not anti-intellectualist, it is anti-rationalist. Chapter 7. The Thomistic Answer to the Ideals of Modern Philosophy. Though the expression of philosophical systems be diverse, there runs through all of them a common current. The spirit of the times is one, though its expression be multiple. The negative goal towards which modern philosophy is striving is manifestly non-intellectual. This aspect we have already examined historically. The positive ideals of the 20th century thinking remain to be examined. These ideals are said to be novel and newborn. They may have had distant antecedents, but they themselves are said never to have existed before. They are begotten chiefly by new advances in science and by a new outlook on the facts of experience. Such being the case, it is presumed that there can be no possible reconciliation between a philosophy which was begotten when science was alchemy and a philosophy born of the newest and latest discoveries of the century. What fellowship could there be between light and darkness? Is not scholastic philosophy the philosophy of the Dark Ages? Can anything of good come from Nazareth? On the face of it, the modern prejudice against scholasticism seems to rest on the solid foundation. It is quite true that St. Thomas did not have such scientists as Bateson, Dahum, Poincare, and others to lay the experimental foundations of his philosophy. It is also true that the Aristotelian physics and the astronomy upon which he relied have since been discarded. But after all, were Aristotle and the angelic doctor less capable of interpreting the findings of science according to firmly established and self-evident principles than are the philosophers of today? The point of great importance is not the experience on which they have to draw, but the interpretation of it. A conceptual realist like St. Thomas, working on the ordinary and evident facts of daily experience, is certainly more capable of interpreting them than is an extreme idealist, even though the latter works on the facts of modern science. In the last analysis, however, the only way of determining whether or no scholastic philosophy is radically opposed to the ideals of modern philosophy is to compare the two. In following this method, we shall examine first the ideals of modern philosophy and the practical references to the supposed new ideals of scientific infiltration. Then we shall propose a Thomistic appreciation of these ideals, and in doing so we shall show, first, that Thomistic philosophy better realized the ideals of modern philosophy than does modern philosophy itself. Secondly, in refusing to accept the Thomistic ideals, modern philosophy is illogical and false to its own ideals. The ideals of modern philosophy. What are the ideals of modern philosophy? The ideals which best correspond to the progress of science and the new spirit of the age are threefold. 1. Philosophy must be an expression of life and a penetration into life. The application of science to increase, if not the richness, at any rate the fullness and complexity of life, must be an ideal. Any system which can give a fuller measure of life, which can attain a more sympathetic and intimate communion with it, is the philosophy which can claim acceptance in this age. Life, richer, more satisfying life, is the goal of philosophy. In pursuit of this ideal, sympathetic intuitions, religious experiences, desires, and instincts and imaginings have been proposed. Through these means of more intense fellowship and union with life have been promised. Scholastic philosophy is imagined to be the barrier that stands in the way of progress towards life. It is presumed to be a philosophy of the static, a sort of card index system of thought in which everything is rigorously catalogued and from which the spontaneous is rigorously excluded. It is said to be the philosophy of the inert and the lifeless. The constantly recurring objective to it is that it is characterized by a great incapacity for life. 2. The second ideal is that philosophy must express life in its continuity and progressiveness. Progressiveness must be taken seriously. Change and progress must be signs of reality and not of imperfection. It is here that contemporary thought insists on the application of science to philosophy. Dominating the hypothesis of these latter years is of evolution, which manifests life in its gradual unfolding from its lowest even to its highest manifestations. Lamarck, Darwin, Wallace, and their successors have emphasized the evolution of life in biology. Tyndall, Huxley, Spencer, James, Dr. Schiller, M. Leroy, M. Bergson, Professor Perry, and Dr. Shan, and a host of others have done the same for philosophy. If biology showed life to be progressive in its manifestations, why should not philosophy, which is the ultimate science of life, reveal life as a continuity? Scholastic philosophy antedates modern biology. It is consequently suspected of being incapable of expressing the continuity and the evolution of life, both through ignorance and through misunderstanding of its principles. It has become identified with a philosophy of the block universe, where all life is cut up into genus and species and into watertight compartments which allow not the least co-penetration. The intellect which it glorifies is said to distort this life, to solidify and to break up the continuity of life, and to falsify the life it proposes to interpret correctly. Mechanical concepts give only substitutes for life, and are even the cause of death itself. As M. Bergson tells us, instead of showing life in movement, it presents merely some juxtaposed snapshots, which are but poor substitutes. The ideal philosophy must represent the fluid, the progressive, the continuous, and in the eyes of the moderns, the Philosophia Perennis has failed to do this, hence the multitude of substitutes. 3. In the third place, philosophy should not only reveal life as continuous and progressive and fluid, but it should also reveal it as a process of unification. This ideal is a consequence of the modern learning towards biological interpretation. If there is evolution, then the present moment of evolution is the sum of all the previous moments, and the present phase is the sum of previous phases. In accordance with these biological theories, philosophy, it is said, should reveal how man sums up the various stages of evolution which have preceded him. The culture epoch theory of Professor Hall is an absence to this ideal. According to this philosophy of education, the child reveals in his play and in his growth the whole evolution of the race. In the realm of knowledge, man in his cognitive process should recapitulate and unify the cognitive process below him. Thus, M. Bergerson makes his intuition a glorified instinct and a disinterested intelligence. Intuition is said to be higher than both, and recapitulates both. The process of unification is carried still further in the modern doctrines of pantheism, in which God and the world become so unified as to be considered organically one with the other, so that we experience one in and through the other. Such are the three ideals of modern philosophy: the expression of life in its continuity and in its unity. Every year brings forth new systems which better meet these ideals, and in all of them the Philosophia Perennis is dismissed with the magic formula that it is characterized by a great incapacity for life. It is our contention that these ideals are not new. They are not the fruit of recent scientific discoveries, and they are not the new-born offspring of the 19th and the 20th centuries. The principles themselves are metaphysical, not biological. Hence they are capable of being possessed by an age less rigorously scientific than our own. Furthermore, these ideals of modern philosophy are better guaranteed by the philosophy of St. Thomas than by modern philosophy. To this end, we shall show that the modern desires for a philosophy of life is best realized by the Thomistic principle. The more eminent the activity, the higher the life. The second ideal, that philosophy must reveal itself as fluid, as continuous and progressive, is best secured by the principle that a superior nature in its lowest perfection touches an inferior nature in its highest perfection. Or to put it dynamically, movement decreases as the nature becomes more perfect. The third ideal, that life must be expressed as a unit and as a recapitulation of what has gone before, is best realized by the third scholastic principle, that which is divided in inferior beings is united in superior beings, or what is plural in the lower kingdoms is singular in the higher. These notions we shall apply to the various kingdoms to which modern philosophers, and particularly M. Bergerson and Professor Alexander, have applied them: the mineral, vegetable, animal, and rational, in the angelic, together with the Professor Alexander, who goes one step further than M. Bergerson. But in applying the principles to these kingdoms, we are not doing so after the example of these and other modern thinkers, but after the application made in part by Aristotle, Dionysius, St. Gregory the Great, and in full by St. Thomas in the 4th book of the Contragants. The exposition in the chapter which follows is little more than a translation of that remarkable chapter which is to be numbered among the most beautifully synthetic pages St. Thomas has written. Deserves to be considered as well one of the finest pages in the whole realm of philosophy. First principle: the more eminent the activity, the higher the life. Here we aim to show that intelligence in life, inasmuch as it possesses the greatest eminent activity. What is life? To take it into its most simple and elementary manifestation, it is movement, that which moves itself. So reconciled have we become to this elementary manifestation, that our first impulse is to attribute death to anything which should be active and is not. An animal lying quietly in the sunshine gives the appearance of being lifeless as long as it is inactive. As soon as it acts, we attribute life to it. The term life is taken from these external experiences and applied to the nature to which it belongs. Life, then, in its simplest expression, is activity. Activity, however, is twofold. It is either transitive or imminent. So true is this distinction that our very language has preserved the reality of it. A verb expresses action. A transitive verb is one that needs an object to complete it. An intransitive verb or imminent verb requires no object to complete it. It is completed within itself. A transitive action is one whose term of activity is always outside the agent, and which acts not for its own perfection, but for the perfection of a thing distinct from itself. Fire, for example, an imminent action, on the contrary, has its term within the agent itself, and acts for its own perfection, and not for the perfection of something outside itself. Volition, for example. To which of these two activities does life essentially belong? Not to the transitive action as such, although many forms of life do possess transitive action. Beings possess life only in proportion to their imminent activity, and the more imminent the activity, the higher the life. Plant life. The vegetable kingdom is the first of the kingdoms to manifest life. It merits this title in virtue of its imminent activity. Its imminent activity is the process by which it grows, thanks to the elements it takes up from the kingdom below it. It grows imminently by intussusation, not outwardly like a crystal. Its action is the lowest form of the three imminent activities which belong to organic life. Movement of execution, movement of form, and movement towards an end. It has not a movement of form by which it can move from place to place, neither has it the movement towards an end, by which it can choose means to a certain end or even an end in itself. Its end is determined. It possesses merely the movement of execution. The imminent activity of vegetable soul, the body living by the imminent principle, is the object of the vegetable soul. Its operation is threefold: one by which it acquires being, and to this is ordained the generative potency; a second by which the body acquires its due quantity, and to this is ordained the augmentative powers; a third by which the body is kept in being and in its due quantity, and to this is ordained the nutritive powers. In the terms of modern biology, its imminent activity is the anabolic and catabolic process. The internal movement of increase and decrease. Though there is immanent activity in the vegetable kingdom, and consequently life, there is at the same time much imperfection mingled with it. First, the materials which enter into the purification of vegetable kingdom are drawn from the outside air, light, heat, phosphates, and so forth. Secondly, the fruit of its existence is continued apart from the parent. Though the oak, for example, continues its own existence in the acorn, it does so in another individual. There is consequently much transitive activity mingled with the immanent activity in the vegetable kingdom. There is imperfection at both ends, a want of perfection, immanence in its alpha and omega. The animal kingdom. Animal life is superior to plant life in virtue of a double immanent activity which it adds to plant life: the immanence of locomotion and the immanence of sensibility. To the movement of execution which is possessed by plant life, it adds the movement of form locomotion. Its movement is not something imposed on it by nature, as it is on the plants. It is determinable by the animal itself. That is according to its sense knowledge. For St. Thomas, these two go hand in hand. We shall quote here his own words as a revelation of his deep penetration into the order and the laws of the sensible universe. The more perfect the senses, the more perfect is the movement. Those things which have only the sense of touch move themselves by a motion of expansion and contraction, like the oyster, for example, whose motion surpasses but little that of plants. Those things, however, which have a perfect sensitive power not only move themselves to know things immediately near or conjoined to them, but even move themselves by a progressive movement to things in a distance. The relation, then, is direct between the perfection of sense knowledge and the perfection of locomotion. In addition to the immanence of locomotion, animals possess the immanence of sensible knowledge. Animals reveal the first evidence of knowledge in the scale of beings. Thanks to their sensitive knowledge, they can possess imminently the lower orders in another way than the purely biological one. The plant which the animal sees, the water which the animal drinks, are possessed by it not only psychologically, but also sensibly. There is a certain spiritual possession of the particular objects of sense knowledge in addition to the material possession. In virtue of these cognitive immanences, the animal can justly be said to possess more life than plants. Though the animal possesses the immanence of locomotion and the immanence of sense knowledge, though it has a movement of form as well as a movement of execution, it nevertheless lacks perfect life for the reason that it lacks perfect immanent activity. It can never reflect upon itself. The term of its immanent activity is never within itself, but outside itself. In every case, it is the good or the useful apprehended by the senses. As in the plant, the term of its generation is a being distinct from itself both in nature and operation. The end is always ad extra. Still another sign of its imperfection and want of perfect life is that it lacks the movement of end. It cannot choose an end for itself other than that imposed on it by nature. This end imposed is determined by instinct. Hence it is that all larks build their nests in the same way. Sense knowledge, then, is not the key to the perfect and richer life. For the same reason, instinct cannot be the route to that life. We must seek the solution in other fields. Let us see if the intelligence gives the answer. Intelligence, human, angelic, divine. The human intelligence, man's title as king of the universe and paragon of animals, is due to some faculty which he possesses in common with spiritual beings and not with corporal beings. That faculty is the intellect. Thanks to it, man is ranged with angels and with God, for all possess in varying degrees of perfection that great power which Aristotle calls life, and which the angelic doctor calls the most perfect thing in life. The intelligence, as human, stands the lowest among the three grades of intellectual beings. In relation, however, to the lower kingdoms, it is far superior. The human intellect reveals a great eminence of action than is found in any of the lower kingdoms. Its life is therefore more nearly perfect. First, the act of the intelligence remains in the intelligence itself. It is not an act passing to something extrinsic to it. As heat passes to a surrounding body, the terms of the intellectual act is not a symbol of the external object, as we shall see in a following chapter. It is the object itself possessed intentionally by the mind. It is due precisely to this imminent possession of the object that the soul can reflect and know itself. Secondly, the term of the intellectual operation remains in the intellect as its act and as its perfection. The animal kingdom, by the act of generation, perfects the existence of its species in the sense that it continues its existence in its progeny. The intellect, on the contrary, perfects its own existence imminently, as the terms of its generation is in itself and not outside itself. How classify this imminent operation of the intelligence? To which one of the 10 categories of Aristotle does it belong? Does it belong to quality or to action? The answer of one of the recognized interpreters of the angelic doctor is that it belongs to the category of quality, which has the force of action. It does not belong primarily to the category of action, because action implies two elements, one of which cannot be applied to the intellectual operation. One of the elements of action is potentiality, progress towards a term, and this is an imperfection. The other element is actuality, which is the power of producing a term. The first element is wanting to the operation of the intelligence. The perfection of the act of knowing is not in the production of the term, but in its contemplation. The production itself looks to the concept, but the act of knowledge terminates in the thing. The imminent activity does not demand that a term be produced. Nevertheless, it can have one. This being so, it is ranked more properly under the category of quality than under that of action. Though the human intelligence can glory in a more perfect life than that of plants or animals, or even the sensitive and instinctive knowledge of man, though the fecundity of that divine faculty, as Aristotle calls it, generates a term which is more intimately united with its spiritual progenitor, that form is united to matter. Is it altogether free from imperfection? Does it possess that perfect, imminent activity which alone belongs to the rich and perfect and satisfying life? The very fact that the intelligence is dependent on the world of sensible phenomena for the materials of its operation is sufficient indication of its want of perfect immanence. The mind is a tabula rasa. Without sense of experience, it does not function. It is only in potency to the intelligibility which is in things. Just as the plant depends upon the mineral kingdom for the materials of its plant life, just as the animal depends on the mineral kingdom and the vegetable kingdom for the materials of its animal life, so too does the intellectual life of man depend on the materials of sensible experience. Just as prime matter is in potency to natural things, so is our intellect in potency to intelligible things. Both needs to be perfected. The form is the perfection of one. The intelligible species is the perfection of the other. Furthermore, close as the union between the intellect and its term may be, there is still wanting a perfect identity. The external object which is possessed by the intellect is possessed intentionally, that is, by information. If, however, the immanence were perfect, there would be identity. Add to this another limitation of the human intelligence, namely the fact that it is measured. Just as the movement of form and the movement towards an end determines plant life and constitutes its measure, just as the movement towards an end by instinct determines animals and constitutes their measure, so too in man there is something which determines and measures him. This measure in the speculative order is the first principle of thought, and in the practical order is the ultimate end. Through these measures, in relation to the lower order, constitutes the liberty and the glory of man. They are, in relation to the higher order, a mark of imperfection and dependence.